Welcome to The Cultural Contrarian. Our podcasts are intended to be a sequential learning experience to provide a listener a safe and private encounter based upon critical thinking. We intentionally will be inviting listeners to self-examine, to compare and contrast what one believes to be true, what they claim is true, and investigating if something is logically true. Our mission is not necessarily a philosophical one, but one to engage, equip, and empower willing individuals to seek, claim, and reclaim freedom, rights, and independence at their own pace. Please join us becoming aware that we all may be contrarians to the prevailing culture. For those of you that know, I subscribe to multiple newsletters and subscriptions, and one that I find very, very edifying is through Hillsdale College. It's called Imprimis, and if you don't subscribe to it, I strongly encourage you to do so, because there's not just their Imprimis newsletter, but their emails are rather thought-provoking. So even though they may go to your junk mail, I would encourage you to pull them out of your junk mail and read through them. I know reading is a dying art. That's why I'm trying to do these podcasts, to accelerate people's access to information. So this one is written by Michael Rectenwald. The title of the article is called "What is the Great Reset?" Very, very powerful information. So let me give you a little bit of curriculum vitae on Michael Rectenwald. He's the Chief Academic Officer for American Scholars. He has a BA from the University of Pittsburgh, an MA from Case Western Reserve University, a PhD in Literary and Cultural Studies from Carnegie Mellon. He has taught at New York University, Duke, North Carolina Central, Carnegie Mellon, and Case Western. He is the author of numerous books, including the 19th century British Secularism, Science, Religion, and Literature, Google Archipelago, Beyond Woke, and Thought Criminal. The following is adapted from a talk delivered at Hillsdale College on November 7th of 2021 during the Center of Constructive Alternatives Conference on the Great Reset. Go with the article. Is the Great Reset a conspiracy theory imagining a vast left-wing plot to establish a totalitarian one-world government? No, despite the fact that some people may have spun conspiracy theories based upon it with some reason. As we will see, the Great Reset is real. Indeed, last year, Klaus Schwab, founder and executive chairman of the World Economic Forum. If you don't know Klaus Schwab, you might want to do some research on Klaus Schwab. A famous organization made up of the world's political, economic, and cultural elites that meets annually in Davos, Switzerland, and the Thierry Malloret, co-founder and main author of The Monthly Barometer, published a book called COVID-19, The Great Reset. In the book, they define the Great Reset as a means of addressing the weakness of capitalism that were purportedly exposed by the COVID pandemic. The idea of the Great Reset goes back much further. It can be traced at least as far back as the inception of the WEF, originally founded as the European Management Forum in 1971. In that same year, Schwab, an engineer and economist by training, published his first book. I would say Klaus Schwab has a very high IQ, 150 or above. He's a very brilliant man, dangerous brilliant man, but a brilliant man. Modern enterprise management and mechanical engineering. It was in this book that Schwab first introduced the concept he would later call stakeholder capitalism, arguing that the management of a modern enterprise must serve not only shareholders, but all stakeholders to achieve long-term growth and prosperity. Schwab and the WEF have promoted the idea of stakeholder capitalism ever since. They can take credit for the stakeholder and public-private partnership rhetoric and policies embraced by governments, corporations, non-governmental organizations, and international governance bodies worldwide. The specific phrase Great Reset came into general circulation over about a decade ago with the publication of a 2010 book, The Great Reset, by American urban studies scholar Richard Florida. written in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis. Florida's book argued that the 2008 economic crash was the latest in a series of great resets, including the long depression of the 1870s and the Great Depression of the 1930s, which he defined as periods of paradigm-shifting systemic innovation. 4 years after Florida's book was published at the 2014 annual meeting of the WEF, Schwab declared, "We want to do in Davos this year is to push the reset button." And subsequently, the image of a reset button would appear on the WEF's website. This is all in plain view, folks. This is not hidden. If we were to peel the layers behind the Rockefeller Foundation and other foundations, they have it in plain view. So we have the ability to tease through these words through what is in public record. In addition, in 2018 and 2019, the WEF organized two events that became the primary inspiration for the current Great Reset Project, and also, for obvious reasons, fresh fodder for conspiracy theorists. Don't blame me for the latter. I'm doing is relating the historical facts. In May of 2018, the WEF collaborated with the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security to conduct CLADE-X, a simulation of a national pandemic response. Specifically, the exercise simulated the outbreak of a novel strain of a human parainfluenza virus with genetic elements of the Nipah virus called CLADE-X. The simulation ended with the news report stating that, in fact, in the face of CLADE-X, without effective vaccines, experts tell us that we could eventually see 30 to 40 million deaths in the U.S. and more than 900 million around the world, 12% of the global population. Clearly, preparation for a global pandemic was in order. In 2019, the WEF collaborated with Johns Hopkins and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation on another pandemic exercise, Event 201, which simulated an international response to the outbreak of a novel coronavirus. This was 2 months before the COVID outbreak in China became news and 5 months before the World Health Organization declared it a pandemic, and it closely resembled the future COVID scenario, including incorporating the idea of asymptomatic spread. The CLADE-X and Event 201 simulations anticipated almost every eventuality of the actual COVID crisis, most notably the responses by governments, health agencies, the media, tech companies, and elements of the public. The responses and their effects included worldwide lockdowns, the collapse of business and industries, the adoption of biometric surveillance technologies, an emphasis on social media censorship to combat misinformation, the flooding of social and legacy media with authoritative sources, let's call these the white coats, widespread riots, and mass unemployment. This is almost like a Jade Helm played out war game. Sounds interesting, doesn't it? If you were to do any research, as I have downloaded hundreds and hundreds of PDFs of public records of different operations sponsored by various entities within federal organizations, this is not surprising in the least. It's practice. Anyway, consider it to the Pacific Theater of War Games. In addition to being promoted as a response to COVID, the Great Reset is promoted as a response to climate change. In 2017, the WEF published a paper entitled "We Need to Reset the Global Operating System to Achieve the United Nations Sustainable Developmental Goals." On June 13, 2019, the WEF signed a Memorandum of Understanding, an MOU, with the United Nations to form a partnership to advance the UN 2030 Agenda in Sustainable Development. Glenn Beck, many years ago, wrote a book called Agenda 21. If you haven't read it, strongly encourage you to read it. It's fiction, but sometimes fiction approaches reality. Good book, Glenn. Shortly after that, the WEF published the United Nations World Economic Forum Strategic Partnership Framework for the 2030 Agenda, promising to help finance the UN's climate change agenda and committing the WEF to help the UN meet the needs of the fourth industrial revolution, including providing assets and expertise for digital governance. In June 2020, at its 50th annual meeting, the WEF announced the Great Reset's official launch. And a month later, Schwab and Mallory published their book on COVID and the Great Reset. The book declared that COVID represents, quote, opportunity that can be seized, close quote, and that, quote, we should take advantage of this unprecedented opportunity to reimagine our world, close quote. That the moment must be seized to take advantage of this unique window of opportunity, and that for those fortunate enough to find themselves in industries naturally resilient to the pandemic, think here of big tech companies like Apple, Google, Facebook, and Amazon, the crisis was not only more bearable, but even a source of profitable opportunities at a time of distress for the majority. Bear with me, I need to wet my whistle here. The Great Reset aims to usher in bewildering economic amalgam Schwab stakeholder capitalism, which I have called corporate socialism, and the Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben has called communist capitalism. In brief, stakeholder capitalism involves the behavioral modification of corporations to benefit not shareholders, but stakeholders, individuals and groups that stand to benefit or lose from corporate behavior. Stakeholder capitalism requires not only corporate responses to pandemics and ecological issues such as climate change, but also rethinking corporations' commitment to already vulnerable communities within their ecosystems. This is the, quote, social justice, close quote, aspect of the Great Reset. To comply with that, government, banks, and asset managers use the Environmental, Social, and Governance ESG index to squeeze non-woke corporations and businesses out of the market. The ESG index is essentially a social credit score that is used to drive ownership and control of production away from non-woke or non-compliant. One of the WEF's many powerful strategic partners, BlackRock Inc., the world's largest asset manager, is solidly behind the stakeholder model. It's not just BlackRock. If you were to look at the 4 major financial asset holders and the stocks that they hold, BlackRock is one, State Street another, Vanguard another, important names to know. In 2021 letter to CEOs, BlackRock CEO Larry Fink declared that climate risk is investment risk, and the creation of sustainable index investments has enabled a massive acceleration of capital towards companies better prepared to address climate risk. The COVID pandemic, Fink wrote, accelerated the flow of funds towards sustainable investments. Pause. There are some folks that are on private areas online that are tracking the investments of politicians into the options that they're buying or putting or the stocks that they're buying. And they're also reporting on the upticks or the changes that are happening in those stocks over time. So I have not heard of many politicians that have made losing bets on the investments that they make. They always seem to be on the winning side. Why is that? Because they have insider information related to the legislation or bills or laws that they're going to pass to the benefit and influence of those corporations. So they have an inside track. So these clever investors are keeping an eye through the public record and disclosure statements as to what the investors, these politicians, are investing in. Interesting tactic, very wise. I continue. We have long believed that our clients, as shareholders in your company, will benefit if you can create enduring sustainable value for all of your stakeholders. As more and more investors choose to tilt their investments towards sustainably focused companies, the tectonic shift we are seeing will accelerate further. And because this will have such a dramatic impact on how capital is allocated, every management team and board will need to consider how this will impact their company's stock. Pause again. I recently was sharing with someone via a text a little bit of humor, and I'm going to kind of paraphrase what I said in text to create this new analogy. You, private citizen, are not a stakeholder. You're not even a shareholder. You're an occupant on this terraform planet. And we are effectively being drilled or financially sodomized by Klaus Schwab, BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, and others, and our political elite, the bankers and the attorneys. Folks, the attorneys rule this planet. No decision is being made, no document is being written, no 10K, 10Q report is being furnished, absent through the review eyes interpretation of those that speak the legalese. We're under the control of the attorneys, and they are the gauntlet. Unpause. Fink's letter is more than a report to CEOs. It is an implicit threat, be woke or else. In the recent book on the Great Reset, Schwab and Malleret pit stakeholder capitalism against neoliberalism, defining the latter as a corpus of ideas and policies favoring competition over solidarity, creative destruction over government intervention, and economic growth over social warfare. In other words, neoliberalism refers to the free enterprise system. In opposing that system, stakeholder capitalism entails corporate cooperation with the state and vastly increased government intervention in the economy. I personally believe this is an element of chaos theory. And one worldview, an evolutionary worldview, believes that organization can emerge out of something disorganized. So something better can be bred out of chaos. I wrote an ebook on that. Might be interesting to read, talking about chaos and the collision of worldviews, but I digress. Proponents of the Great Reset hold neoliberalism responsible for our economic woes. But in truth, the governmental favoring of industries and players within industries, what used to be known as corporatism or economic fascism, has been the real source of what Schwab and his allies at the WEF decry. While approved corporations are not necessarily monopolies, the tendency of the Great Reset is toward monopolization, vesting as much control over production and distribution in as few favored corporations as possible, while eliminating industries and producers deemed non-essential or inimical. Pause for a second. You've heard that word, non-essential. Who gets to define what is essential? I'm an essential employee for my family. My wife is an essential employee. Somebody sitting up higher in status doesn't get to define another's essentialness. Continue. To break this reset about, Schwab writes, every country from the United States to China must participate, and every industry from oil and gas to tech must be transformed. Another way of describing the goal of the Great Reset is capitalism with Chinese characteristics, a two-tiered economy with profitable monopolies and the state on top and socialism for the majority below. Several decades ago, as China's growing reliance on the for-profit sectors of its economy could no longer be credibly denied by the Chinese Communist Party, its leadership approved the slogan, socialism with Chinese characteristics, to describe its economic system. Formulated by Deng Xiaoping, the phrase was meant to rationalize the CCP's allowance of for-profit development under socialist political system. The CCP considered the privatization of the Chinese economy to be a temporary phase, lasting as long as 100 years if necessary on the way to communist society. Party leaders maintain that this approach has been necessary in China because socialism was introduced too early there. When China was backward agrarian country, China needed a capitalist booster shot. An interesting thing when you get into Chinese philosophy, they think and plan and function based upon generations. The U.S. plans things based upon election cycles. So we're in 1, 2, 4 year increments. Chinese are thinking historically. Just a collision of worldviews. Stripped of its socialist ideological pretensions, the Chinese system amounts to a socialist or communist state increasingly funded by capitalist economic development. The difference between the former Soviet Union and contemporary China is that when it became obvious that a socialist economy had failed, the former gave up its socialist economic pretenses, while the later has not. The Great Reset represents the development of the Chinese system in the West, but in reverse. Whereas the Chinese political class began with a socialist political system and then introduced privately held for-profit production, the West began with capitalism and is now implementing a Chinese-style political system. The Chinese-style system includes vastly increased state intervention in the economy on the one hand, and on the other, the kind of authoritarian measures that the Chinese government uses to control its population. Social credit score is an example. Schwab and Mallory write that if the past 5 centuries in Europe and America have taught us anything, it is that acute crises contribute to boosting the power of the state. It's always been the case, and there is no reason it should be different with the COVID-19 pandemic. The draconian lockdown measures employed by Western governments managed to accomplish goals of which corporate socialists in the WEF could only dream. Above all, the destruction of small businesses, eliminating competitors for corporate monopolists favoring the state. In the U.S. alone, according to the Foundation of Economic Education, millions of small businesses closed their doors due to the lockdowns. Yelp data indicates that 60% of those closures are now permanent. Meanwhile, companies like Amazon, Apple, Facebook, and Google enjoyed record gains. Just as a side note, economic impact is when our government allowed tenants to not pay their rent and allow them to squat and had no financial remedy for the landlord. That was a proxy, unlawful act that devastated the real estate market and those real estate holdings. Anyway, other developments that advanced the Great Reset agenda have included unfettered immigration, travel restrictions for otherwise legal border crossings, the Federal Reserve's unrestrained printing of money and the subsequent inflation, increased taxation, increased dependence on the state, broken supply chains, the restrictions and job losses due to vaccine mandates, and the prospects of personal carbon allowances. That's a major win for our friend at Tesla. He's making bank on all those carbon credits. And you know, we are in the season, you've heard of quantitative easing 1, quantitative easing 2, quantitative easing 3. We're in quantitative easing forever. We're not going to stop. It's always kicking this ball down the field, and we're going to have to pay the piper. Such policies reflect the fairness aspect of the Great Reset. Fairness requires lowering the economic status of people in wealthier nations like the U.S. relative to that of people in poorer regions of the world. One of the functions of woke ideology is to make the majority in developed countries feel guilty about their wealth. Gaslighting them? Which the elites aim to reset downward, except one notices for the elites themselves, who need to be rich in order to fly in their private jets to Davos every year. The Great Reset's corporate stakeholder model overlaps with its governance and geopolitical model. States and favored corporations are combined in public-private partnerships and together have control of governance. This corporate-style hybrid is largely unaccountable to the constituents of national governments. Governance is not only increasingly privatized, but also, and more importantly, corporations are deputized as major additions to governments and intergovernmental bodies. The state is thereby extended, enhanced, and augmented by the addition of enormous corporate assets. As such, corporations become what I have called, quote, governmentalities, end quote. Otherwise, private organizations wield as state apparatuses, with no obligation to answer those pesky voters. Since these corporations are multinational, the state essentially becomes globalist, whether or not one world government is ever formalized. As if the economic and governmental resets were not dramatic enough, the technological reset reads like a dystopian science fiction novel. It is based upon the Fourth Industrial Revolution, or 4IR for short. The first, second, and third industrial revolutions were mechanical, electrical, and digital revolution. The 4IR marks the convergence of existing and emerging fields, including big data, artificial intelligence, machine learning, quantum computing, genetics, nanotechnology, and robotics. Holy smokes. It's like this guy was reading my post the other day. This is kind of crazy. The foreseen result was the merging of the physical, digital, and biological worlds, which presents a challenge to the ontologies by which we understand ourselves and the world, including the definition of a human being. There's nothing original about this. Transhumanists and singularitarians, prophets of technological singularity, such as Ray Kurzweil, holy smokes, Has anybody read Ray Kurzweil from Google? May want to pick up some of his books. Forecasted these and other revolutionary developments long ago. Yes, he did. Holy smokes. At the quantum level, unbelievable. Kurzweil was a visionary. What's different about the globalist visions of 4IR is the attempt to harness it to the ends of the Great Reset. If already existing 4IR developments are any indication of the future, then the claim that it will contribute to human happiness is false. These developments include internet algorithms that feed users prescribed news and advertisements and downrank or exclude banned content, algorithms that censor social media content and consign dangerous individuals and organizations to digital gulags, keyword warrants based on search engine inputs, apps that track and trace COVID violations and report offenders to the police, robot police with scanners to identify and round up unvaccinated and other dissidents, and smart cities where residents are digital entities to be monitored, surveilled, and recorded, and where data on their every move is collected, collated, stored, and attached to a digital identity and social credit score. Bingo! Ryan's been talking about this forever and talking about there is no expectation of privacy, and we are just data supplying carbon life forms interacting on digital domains where every keystroke is logged, and we're just part of this massive database of data. In short, 4IR technologies subject human beings to a kind of technological management that makes surveillance by the NSA look like child's play. Schwab goes so far as to cheer developments that aim to connect human brains directly to the cloud for the sake of data mining our thoughts and memories. If successful, this would constitute a technological mastery over decision-making that would threaten human autonomy and undermine free will. I did a lecture on that to the California Unified Schools, to their STEM program, specifically talking about brain hacking and chemical manipulation of the brain chemistry, serotonin, dopamine, cortisol, all through the digital encounter, such as video games, and how you are being programmed to receive notifications for your Instagram posts, whether you get them one every hour or they pull them and hit you with the dopamine rush in groups. It's all social programming. The 4IR seeks to accelerate the merging of humans and machines, resulting in a world in which all information, including genetic information, is shared and every action, thought, and motivation is known, predicted, and possibly precluded. Unless taken out of the hands of corporate socialist technocrats, the 4IR will eventually lead to virtual and inescapable prison of body and mind. In terms of the social order, the Great Reset promises inclusion in a shared destiny, but the subordination of so-called netizens implies economic and political disenfranchisement, a hypervigilance over self and others, and social isolation, or what Hannah Arendt called organized loneliness on a global scale. This organized loneliness is already manifest in lockdowns, masking, social distancing, and social exclusion of the unvaccinated. Look at Australia as a prime example. The title of the Ad Council's March 2020 public service announcement, Alone Together, perfectly captures this sense of organized loneliness. That's a logical fallacy, alone together. Anyway, in my recent book, The Google Archipelago, I argued that leftist authoritarianism is the political ideology and modus operandi of what I call big digital, which is the leading edge of a nascent world system. Big digital is the communications, ideological, and technological arm of an emerging corporate socialist totalitarianism. The Great Reset is the name that has since been given to the project of establishing this world system. Just as Schwab and the WEF predicted, the COVID crisis has accelerated the Great Reset. Monopolistic corporations have consolidated their grip on the economy from above, while socialism continues to advance for the rest of us below. In partnership with Big Digital, Big Pharma, the mainstream media, national and international health agencies, and compliant populations, hitherto democratic Western states, think especially Australia, New Zealand, and Austria, are being transformed into totalitarian regimes modeled after China. Kind of like reminiscent of Austria in 1930. But let me end on a note of hope, because the goals of the Great Reset depend on the obliteration not only of free markets, but of individual liberty and free will. It is, perhaps ironically, unsustainable. Like earlier attempts at totalitarianism, the Great Reset is doomed to ultimate failure. That doesn't mean, however, that it won't, again, like those earlier attempts, leave a lot of destruction in its wake, which is all the more reasons to oppose it now with all of our might. Fantastic article. I enjoy consuming this stuff. I don't know how many people enjoy hearing it because it's like death, destruction, and despair, people dying everywhere. It's your birthday, man. It's your birthday. Celebrate. But I prefer to have this in my cranium so I can add it to the lens when I'm applying discernment as I navigate life. So put that in your intellectual pipe and smoke it. Thanks for listening. Take care. Thanks for being part of the Cultural Contrarian family. If you haven't already taken the step to see the broader efforts of the CC family, I invite you to go to bit.ly/team-cc. Remember, we can choose to remain tough on ourselves, tender towards others, and always teachable. Have a blessed day.